Good evening, and welcome to this panel discussion on interpreting slavery at historic sites and museums with alumni of the Cooperstown Graduate Program in Museum Studies at SUNY Oneonta. I'm Will Walker, Associate Professor of History at the Cooperstown Graduate Program, and I'll be the moderator for tonight's discussion. This program is presented by the SUNY Oneonta Alumni Association and the Common Read Committee. Each year, the committee selects a book that members of the campus community are encouraged to read and discuss. According to the committee's website, SUNY Oneonta's Common Read advances diversity by encouraging students to examine and better understand topics such as equity, inclusion, and personal history through many lenses. It aims to further infuse cultural literacy into our academic program by asking the campus community to read a diversity-related book, which then is discussed in fall courses across several disciplines. The author of the book is invited to deliver the Mills Distinguished Lectureship, which is named to honor the memory of Professor Albert Mills and his wife, Helena. Their bequest to the SUNY Oneonta Foundation led to the establishment in 1988 of a fund to bring prominent speakers to our campus. Clint Smith, author of How the Word Is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America, will deliver the Mills Lecture on October 23rd at 7 p.m. in the Alumni Fieldhouse. A live stream will also be available. How the Word Is Passed was named one of the New York Times 10 Best Books of 2021. It was also the winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction and the 2022 winner of the Hillman Prize for Book Journalism. I remember eagerly picking up a copy of the book when it was published a couple of years ago because of its close connections to the work I've spent over 20 years of my career both doing and teaching about, interpreting history for broad audiences of visitors to historic sites and museums. I was particularly struck by Smith's sensitivity to the challenges and nuances of this work. His book is not a litany of all the things museums and historic sites are doing wrong, although he shares his fair share of critiques. Rather, it is a thoughtful exploration of the personal, social, and cultural dynamics that shape our experiences at these complex and multi-layered sites. As I read the book, I was pleased to come across a familiar name. Linnea Grimm, one of our panelists tonight, who was featured and quoted in the Monticello chapter. Linnea's appearance in the text made perfect sense to me because this is precisely the type of work we prepare our students to do at the Cooperstown Graduate Program. When I learned that Smith's book would be this year's Common Read then, I knew that we needed to bring together a panel of alumni who work at sites that interpret the history and legacies of slavery to share their experiences and perspectives. And that is how we ended up with this distinguished group of panelists tonight. I will begin by inviting the panelists to introduce themselves and to provide a brief overview of how their historic site interprets slavery and the lives of enslaved people and their role in that process. A brief note before I turn things over to them. When we talk about interpreting slavery, we'll take a broad view of the type of work that this encompasses, including frontline interpretation, house tours, for example, as well as museum education programs, workshops, exhibitions, oral history projects, and digital initiatives. After the panelists do their introductions, we'll turn to a series of questions, followed by a Q&A with the audience. We'll wrap up no later than 8:15 p.m. So let's get started. Linnea, would you start off the introductions for us?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Will. And I am so happy to be here with all of you this evening to be talking about interpreting slavery at historic sites and museums. I joined the Monticello staff as the manager of interpretive programs in December of 2006, and I subsequently was the director of education and interpretation for about 11 years. And then for the 2 years, my final 2 years at Monticello, I was the vice president of guest experiences. In March of this year, made a huge transition and moved to Portsmouth, New Hampshire to become the president and CEO of the Strawberry Bank Museum. And for those of you who don't know Strawberry Bank, it really is a gem here on the seacoast of New Hampshire. We're an outdoor living history museum located about an hour north of Boston, an hour south of Portland, Maine. We have about 9 acres of campus that we call it, where we have about 36 historic buildings. And we tell the history, over 300 years of history through these different buildings. So Will had asked us to give an overview of how we interpret slavery at our current and former sites. And one of my fellow panelists, Steve Light, is at Monticello now. He and I worked there together for many years, so I'll let him cover a lot of the Monticello work. But I wanted to start out by saying one of the interesting things to me about my time working at Monticello and talking about slavery at Monticello was I really saw a shift in going from just a solely forensic truth approach to slavery. There is a lot of record keeping at Monticello, to, especially in the last several years, more meaning making through what those records tell us about slavery at Monticello. What did it mean to be enslaved? What did it mean to be an enslaver? What are the impacts of slavery that stay with us today? And I know as a panel, we'll be talking about that for the rest of the hour. At Strawberry Bank, it's been a really interesting transition. So I went from a site that had a lot of documentation to one that has very little about slavery in New Hampshire. We have, it's literally about a half page of documentation on those people who were enslaved here on our historic site in Portsmouth. And I was excited to learn right before I'd started here that the staff had contracted with Kristen Gallus, who is a recognized expert in the field, to craft a interpretation plan for Black history at Strawberry Bank. So right as I was getting here, that plan was coming to conclusion. And we have the opportunity to talk with our guests about those few people whose names we know and who were enslaved here at Strawberry Bank, but also about the economic implications of slavery and the bedrock that slavery was in terms of the economic system within the United States, and especially important in recognizing here in New England. So we have been talking about that some here. I'm really looking forward to hearing from others about their experiences, particularly interpreting slavery in New England. And also very much looking forward to hearing the insights from my fellow panelists. So thank you.
I think it would be natural to go to Steve now.
All right. Thank you, Will, and thank you, Linnea, for leaving the Monticello story to me. I'm excited to be here with you all tonight to talk about this topic. As Linnea mentioned, I work at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. I joined the staff. Linnea actually hired me in 2013 as the manager of house tours. I then, when Linnea became vice president, became the director of education and visitor programs, which was her old position. And now that Linnea has moved on to Strawberry Bank, I am the interim vice president of guest experiences at Monticello. Monticello, of course, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is the home of Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, founder of the University of Virginia, architect of the home. But Monticello was also a 5,000-acre plantation. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, but over the course of his life, he enslaved more than 600 people, including more than 400 people who lived at Monticello during his lifetime. And of course, he fathered children with one of those enslaved people, a woman named Sally Hemings. So at Monticello, we have kind of the task of both interpreting the life and legacy of Thomas Jefferson as one of the important figures in the early history of the United States and his contributions to the United States, while also interpreting Monticello as an international site of conscience and the place where more than 400 people were enslaved and what their lives were. And we'll get a chance to talk about this tonight, but obviously we have a wide range of visitor expectations for how and what we will interpret when they come to Monticello, and that is a unique challenge and opportunity for us. So looking forward to hearing what my co-panelists have to say and having that conversation.
Great. And now, Emily.
Sure. Well, yes, that's convenient since I'm sitting next. Yes, so my name is Emily Voss. I am currently the Senior Manager of National Programs and Professional Development at the Center for Civic Education. But until 1 year ago, I was the Director of Education at the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution at James Madison's Montpelier, where I was for 9 years. So Montpelier, being just up the road from Monticello, has some similarities and a great deal of differences in the way that Montpelier is able to interpret the enslaved community who lived and worked for 3 generations of Madisons. While I was there in 2017, Montpelier opened the Mere Distinction of Color, which was a truly phenomenal exhibit located in the cellar level of the house, which was a partnership with the descendant community to interpret the lives of people who lived at Montpelier, but then also to tackle the issue of how slavery worked its way into being protected in the United States Constitution and what legacies there are from the decisions made in Philadelphia in 1787. So it was a lot to take on in a relatively short footprint, but it was a truly phenomenal exhibit and still is. In addition to Mere Distinction of Color, there is also a variety of structures immediately adjacent to the Madison House, which we would call the South Yard. And these are living and working spaces rebuilt that would have been used by enslaved people who served in the house directly. And all of those spaces also had exhibits in them as well that were focused on individual stories, as well as some degree of myth busting. And that's one thing I want to talk about later too. So those were kind of 2 big elements that were part of the physical space of Montpelier, but along with that, there were a lot of additional programs and digital efforts that went on as well. So shout out to my colleague, Hillary Hicks, for her amazing work on the naming project. So the naming project is an effort to basically create biographies with the historical records that Hillary was able to dig into to create biographies for as many of the enslaved community members as we possibly could. So it's an incredible effort, and Hillary has posted the link there, so please check that out later. So for my part, with the Center for the Constitution, my involvement with these things had to do with the training of teachers. And so I would often host multi-day programs, often in conjunction with Facing History and Ourselves, which offers fantastic teaching resources. But we would work with teachers to learn a great deal of background that most Americans and many teachers do not have on the history of enslavement, on the history of the Constitution, and then also start working with them to come up with ways to appropriately introduce that to their students, depending on the age of their students. So I'm happy to chat about that more too, but thanks very much for the opportunity.
Great. And now Tremia.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Will. Thank you, everyone. This is a really an honor to speak with you all. Very similar to Emily and Steve and Linnea, I work as the Director of Learning at George Washington's Mount Vernon, right outside Washington, D.C. I'm also class of 2012, and I joined Mount Vernon in March of 2022 last year. Mount Vernon's mission is to preserve, restore, and manage the estate of George Washington, to the highest standards and to educate the world on the life and legacy so that his character of George Washington's life and character and leadership can inspire future generations. And in my role as director, I provide a way of engaging teachers, students, and families with this history through developing programming, encouraging training, but also working directly with the League of Descendants of the Enslaved, who are descended from the enslaved members of the enslaved community at Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon is the house that George Washington lived in. It's a farm, it's a museum, it's an orientation center, it's an archive and a research library. We also have a burial ground, predominantly enslaved people were buried there. And then we also have the tomb. So George Washington and Martha are buried at Mount Vernon as well. So we use George Washington as an entry point to talk about the diversity of the 18th century. The interpretation, focuses not just on his influence on the world, but the world's influence on him, which includes the 317 enslaved individuals who lived here when George Washington died. The site is really unique in that we have an extremely rich set of primary sources, very similar to Monticello. While not in the hands of the enslaved, they were created by George Washington and his overseers, but they tell a really unique story about enslaved life here. And we're very lucky to be able to talk through tours, through programming, by talking about the names and biographies of family relationships and occupations of the enslaved people here. In 2016, we had a really award-winning exhibition called Lives Bound Together, which I'll put in the chat, which told the story of the community of enslaved and George Washington's changing views on slavery. The exhibition still influences our interpretations, our resources, our trainings, educational outreach, and everything that we do. Like I mentioned, I also work with the League of Descendants of the Enslaved at Mount Vernon, which is an organization comprised of the descendants. And they, through the work with consulting and through direct programmatic work, we work really closely with them. And finally, we hold memorial commemorations daily at the burial grounds. We also have a major annual cemetery commemorative event. It's actually happening this Sunday or Saturday. And we have another major event where we're doing a fundraiser to provide an African-American research fellow here at Mount Vernon to do research on the enslaved community on a permanent basis. So a lot of growth. We're not perfect at all in terms of our interpretation of slavery here, but we're continually improving.
Great. And Melissa.
I'm Melissa Kievit, class of 2017, and I'm the executive director at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum in Upper Manhattan. Just for a little background, the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum is a Dutch colonial farmhouse built in 1784, just after the Revolutionary War. The house was in family ownership for, over 100 years. And then in the early 1900s, it was bought by two descendants of the last Dyckman to live in the home. And I say all that to say this: the women fixed it up and donated it to the city in 1916. So we have been a museum for over 100 years. It is owned by the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, and up until 2011, it was run strictly by the Parks Department. And then in 2011, a nonprofit was formed to run the museum. So we are still like a new burgeoning, nonprofit, very small. We have a full-time staff of 4, and we started the process of learning about enslavement at the site in 2015 with a grant to do some research. We were able to uncover 5 names, and so we have used that research to interpret in several different ways. Because we are so small, we weren't able to just reinterpret the site all at once. So we started with doing artist exhibitions and having local artists. We actually are in a neighborhood that just has so many great artists. So we just started getting some local artists to react to the research that we were finding and create exhibitions around that. And then we began, changing our programming. We have programs such as our Talking About Race Matters lecture series, where we talk about race in a historical context, but also from a lot of different academic lenses, and have carried that through into our Dykeman discussion series, where we talk about these topics historically, but also as they relate to our current day. And then we are in the process of, we've just finished up our reinterpretive plan. We're in the process of reinterpreting the entire site. We also act as a steward for the enslaved burial site that is a couple of blocks away from where the farmhouse now sits. And when I say we act as a steward, that site has had an auto body shop and a school parking lot on top of it for a very long time. And now there is a shelter going in that spot. There are no remains left there, but we have found remains in deposited at other museums, and we're working to repatriate and have those remains reinterred on the site, where there will be a memorial placed. So we're just acting as stewards of that site and helping with that process. Another thing that we do, in addition to talking about this history with our community, in order to serve the museum community, is we along with several other organizations, created a group called the Northern Slavery Collective, because a lot of us in these small historic sites especially felt like we were kind of doing this work in a bubble all on our own, and we needed a support group and people to talk to about how to go about things. How do we find funding? What are some research techniques? And so we created the Northern Slavery Collective, and we had our first conference last February. And our second conference is coming up in this February, and have a lot of gatherings together just to brainstorm and that sort of thing. So it's a little bit about how we're interpreting slavery at the site now. Of course, we have worked our information into tours and that sort of thing, but there's a lot more on the horizon that we're working on.
So I hope that our audience members are getting a sense that there's a lot of energy, there are a lot of things going on, and there has been for a little while now. So my first question is, and I'll turn this to Linnea first, I think, and then others can jump in with their perspectives, is to talk a bit about how the interpretation of slavery at museums and historic sites has changed over the past, let's say, 10 years, because there's been quite a lot going on for longer than that, but certainly over that time, there's been a tremendous amount of attention and energy and some innovative things happening.
Yeah. So I think you're picking up where I was thinking about in my opening remarks of I had mentioned kind of a forensic truth approach. And when I'm talking about that, there is a work done by the South African Reconciliation Commission on 4 Truths, part of the training that many of us at Monticello did on facilitated dialogue, and that idea of the forensic truth of, you know, what does archaeology show? What do the record books show? When I started at Monticello, there was a long, already decades long, amount of work that had been done on that research of looking at those types of pieces of evidence. But I would say one of those biggest shifts that I saw was that transformation to what do we do with that information? How are we talking about it? Who's talking about it? So I would say that's probably one of the other really big shifts that I've seen in 5 to 10 years, is that either co-curated or different types of power sharing of who's telling the story. And so I know at Monticello, there was a lot of work with the descendant community, particularly with the exhibitions that we were developing. And I think there are a lot of sites that have really taken that on and really done it very brilliantly. But I think it takes it from that, well, we discovered exactly this archaeological artifact here, to saying, okay, what does that mean for us today? And so I think we're continuing to see that type of shift.
Yeah, and you know, you mentioned descendant communities. So, you know, one of the key developments really in recent years has been much more engagement with descendant communities. So I wonder if Mia, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I would say, you know, for us, it really started with the Lives Bound Together exhibit, where we really pushed our staff to start really engaging with this history in a deep way. And out of that exhibit, we found a lot of descendants, and like they actually started meeting each other because they really hadn't met each other before this exhibit. So really, and that was in 2016. So these conversations, I think, had started. And I think that being able to work with descendants and like slowly beginning to bring them in or talk to them and explain what we do, and share that authority, I think has been really helpful in forwarding this movement, at least definitely for us.
Right. And for those, I guess, who are not in the public history museum world, when we talk about descendant communities, we are literally talking about descendants of people who were enslaved at these sites, or nearby, you know, in the community or in the region, right? Their family members are still there, they're still present, and they are, you know, engaging with the sites. Steve and Emily, you want to jump in here a little bit?
Yeah, I'll put forward as well. Montpelier also had been working with a descendant community as well, moving into the exhibit that I spoke about earlier, Mere Distinction of Color, and still has a strong relationship with the descendant community there as well. The addition I'll make is actually in 2018, Montpelier hosted a summit on the interpretation of slavery, and there were representatives from lots of different historic sites. There were scholars, there were descendants, and the objective of the summit was to create basically a rubric, a model that our sites could use to sort of see where we stand in terms of how well we're doing as sites that interpret slavery, to engage with descendants and do the highest and best possible job that we could to work on community dialogue and have the best historical research, the best preservation, but all with the engagement of the descendants at its core. So the rubric did come out of that, and yeah, that certainly was a guidepost for Montpelier's efforts moving forward from there.
And I'll just add on to that, yeah, echoing Emily's comments about the rubric and Montpelier's role, and everyone highlighting the importance of descendant engagement. Certainly in our work at Monticello, you know, we have the Getting Word Oral History Project, which was started in 1993. And so it's a long-standing oral history project, engaging the descendants of the enslaved people at Monticello. But the way in which we worked with and engaged those descendants to have them have some input into the interpretation and the stories that we told I do think has really changed a lot as a result of this conversation at sites like Montpelier and others in the last few years. I would also highlight kind of two other things in terms of what has changed the most in interpreting slavery in the last 10 years. And I think, historiography always tells you to look at what's going on at the time that history is being written. And I think you can't ignore, starting with probably Charleston in 2015, certainly here in Charlottesville, what happened here in 2017 had a dramatic impact on our staff and our community and the way in which we told the story of slavery. And then, of course, the murder of George Floyd. And the way I think it shifted the conversation, to Linnea's point about moving away from forensic truth, it became less about telling the history, just the history. I mean, we still told the history of enslaved people at Monticello, but part of that conversation became an essential question about the legacy of these stories and really the legacy of racism, and pulling that story forward so that people could begin to connect the dots and see the ways in which the legacy of these stories that we had been telling were really playing out still in our communities today. And I think those events really profoundly shaped that. And then the third, and I think related way that all of this has changed in the last few years is the polarization. This is not necessarily new, but in terms of people having very strong reactions and oftentimes very opposite and strong reactions to the stories we tell, and the politicization of the history that we tell has made being a frontline interpreter in this work, and particularly interpreting the story of slavery, I think, one of the most difficult jobs that people can have in the museum field. And I think that's in the last 5 to 10 years. Certainly it was difficult before that and other times in history, but certainly in my time in Monticello from 2013 to 2023, I would say the last 5 years have been much harder to interpret the story of slavery than the 5 years before that.
So that takes us naturally into my next question. We all know that there are bumps in the road, that this is challenging work. So what are some of the challenges you have faced and that you're able to talk about in advancing the interpretation of slavery? And I'll just open that up for whoever wants to take it.
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
I'll jump in just to add on to that. I would say one thing, just to give amazing credit to Linnea. I think one of the challenges in interpreting slavery is hiring the right people to do it. And that was a huge challenge at Monticello, in terms of making sure that the people that were hired had kind of the context and background, but more importantly, the kind of open mind to learn history and be able to interpret that in a nuanced and engaging way. And I think sometimes it's a challenge in making sure you have the right staff who are able to engage with the public. And I think that's what Linnea did at Monticello. I think the challenge we face now is, particularly at a place like Monticello and certainly at a place like Mount Vernon, where you have people who have been revered as heroes and put on pedestals, and you have a lot of different things about their lives to interpret. You have people coming with very different ideas of what they're going to see. And some people might show up at a place like Montpelier or Mount Vernon or Monticello and not know that they're plantations, and not know that there were enslaved people there, and only know that they're visiting this place of this founding father. On the flip side, you might have on the very same tour people showing up precisely because it's a plantation, and precisely because they want to challenge you, and because they want to make sure that you're telling the story of the lives of enslaved people appropriately. And that can be really challenging. And I think one of the things that we do have to work with our interpreters on is how to meet people where they are, so that you're giving them some of what they expect out of their visit, but also challenging their worldview and causing them to ask questions in a way that doesn't make them close you down. And I think that's one of the challenges we face.
Yeah. And I'll just add briefly to Steve's point. The staff of any of our sites might be ready to push the interpretation way over here tomorrow, but that is not what our visitors are ready for. So, I mean, it's a challenge for us because, you know, there's a lot of things we might want to bring up on a tour or things we might want to expose people to. But as Steve said, we have to also have an understanding of where are our visitors at, and, you know, how can we move them a little, even if we're not ready to move them all the way over.
Yeah, and I wonder too, you know, so we're sort of talking about that frontline interpretation piece here, right? People who show up, they want to go on a tour, you know, and what are their expectations? But there are other ways that museums engage with visitors, right? And sometimes that engagement goes beyond the site, you know, through a school visit, through an online workshop, right? Through teacher training, like you've done, Emily, you know. So, you know, there are other modalities, there are other ways that museums and historic sites are engaging people in these conversations and these discussions of these issues. I know that, you know, asking folks about challenges, there's institutional context, you know, people are at different stages in their career where, you know, they feel comfortable talking about these things or not, you know. So you know, I think something that I've seen very clearly over the years, and I think Steve alluded to this, is the importance of leadership, right? Having leadership in place that you know, is supportive of doing this kind of work and is supportive of you know, the research and the staff who are implementing it on a daily basis, knowing that there are going to be bumps in the road, that it's not always going to be perfect, but that this is important work and it's worth doing. And, you know, you're going to be there to kind of back the staff when there's a little bit of pushback or a lot of pushback.
I agree with that. I think it's incredibly helpful to have leaders, especially and directors who understand. Like, our director is a scholar. He's a researcher, so he's a historian. So he's someone who knows his history and is really open to discussion and talking about this. Definitely, I agree with Steve. Actually, that was something that I wrote in my notes. This is like how to help people understand that nuances of enslavement, and that multiple things can be true. And it's a challenge for both adults and children, and bringing this history. But yeah, it's a lot. I'm lucky in that I have a director and a president who is they understand that this history needs to be told, and they're very supportive of us and our team. I'm talking about that.
I was going to jump in and say one of the challenges that I see here and at Monticello is the just baseline knowledge that people bring with them about slavery. So to that point about those nuances, I feel like, and Melissa may feel this too, that when you're in the North, just saying, yes, there was slavery in the North, like we're not getting much beyond that at times. It feels like just establishing that fact and the centrality of slavery to the history of the entire United States. I think we also are starting to see that change, although maybe one of the other questions will touch on some of the politicization with education and slavery today, because I definitely in Monticello saw a generational shift of what people were taught about slavery. We did a lot of work with our guides there and hearing about what introductions did they have to slavery in school versus generations now. And again, I know that varies on where you are, but we could see a clear difference. And so I think it is a challenge of how are you approaching some people who might be ready for a much more nuanced approach and other people who do not understand. Like there's just a void of understanding about the institution of slavery.
I would 100% agree with that. We still, even though we've been doing this work for a number of years, get people in the museum who just can't believe that, you know, slavery happened in the North. And it's a big reason why we're a part of the Northern Slavery Collective and doing the work to work with other people who are doing that work in the North to make sure, one, that we're telling a cohesive, narrative, that we're not missing parts. And also, I don't know, for about, well, actually, Linnea, you said for your site, you have exactly about half a page of information. We also struggle with the same thing. I feel like these, smaller historic sites didn't keep records the way maybe some of these larger historic sites did. And so we've struggled with the research, and we have to look at other comparable sites, and what happened there could have happened here, and extrapolate some information as well. So that's been a really big struggle for us.
Well, and that's a nice lead into my next question, which is, how do you make sure to present the lives of enslaved people as opposed to enslavers only, right? These sites were often founded as memorials to dead white men, great white men, right? And so there's a long history of telling that story of one individual or, a family, and other people who lived, worked, were enslaved at that site. Their stories are hidden, are ignored. They're not present in the same way in the traditional historical documents that we often look to. So what are some of the ways that you've been able to, at these different sites, surface and tell the stories of enslaved people?
I'll jump in there. I think, Monticello, in many ways, we are lucky in the records that we do have. But when Monticello really first began in the 1980s and 1990s to take seriously the interpretation of the lives of enslaved people, one of the things that they recognized, the staff at the time, was that even though we often like to say that we are one of the best documented plantations in North America, all of the thousands of pages of letters and documents that had names and stories were all either written by Thomas Jefferson or his white family or the white overseers. There was very, very little directly from the perspective of enslaved people. And that was why the Getting Word Oral History Project was founded, specifically to track down descendants of enslaved people who, through their own family history, had passed down the stories of their ancestors who were enslaved at Monticello. And so utilizing those oral histories in combination with the material world of archaeology, as well as the documentary resources we have to try to tell their stories. I think it's important, and we hear this a lot, that slavery is an incredibly dehumanizing institution, but oftentimes it's important to highlight the ways in which enslaved people had agency and made decisions and tried to make their lives better. And one of the ways we do that at Monticello is by trying to carry their stories forward. Enslaved people who gained their freedom moved their family to places where they could better their lives. One of the projects we're currently working on, Andrew Davenport, who's the director of the Getting Word Oral History Project, Monticello today, calls Getting Word an archive from slavery to freedom, and really highlighting the ways in which the descendants of Monticello's enslaved community sought to make real the promises of the Declaration of Independence. So highlighting those kind of stories of resilience in the face of these inhumane institutions, I think, is a really important part of interpreting those stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And anytime that, we can bring together as Linnea was referencing earlier, bring together physical evidence through archaeological records, the archival records, the oral histories. Whenever we can kind of bring all of those things together, it really does help create that fuller vision of an individual's life in a way that just sort of rattling off numbers historically might have been done. So that just makes a much bigger difference. And I mean, one of the more powerful things I used to like to show people in the Mere Distinction of Color exhibit, it was a map, and it was basically showing the far-flung nature of the community of people who had been enslaved at Montpelier. So whether it was folks who were able to travel to a church in a nearby town, or they were able to go to a market up in Fredericksburg, or they traveled further beyond, whether, perhaps they had been sold, perhaps they ran away. But all of their stories of this very large community were drawn from the historical record that Hillary has been so amazing about searching through. So yeah, that as individuals, as families, as communities, being able to bring all of that together is super important.
I want to jump on and add on a little bit on the Monticello side, and something that I'm particularly interested in, which is how artistic response to slavery by descendants or members of the Black community help make some emotional connections with people today, and the history of slavery. So at Monticello, how many, was it only last year? I think it was only last year. We had a couple of pieces of artwork that really were provocative. One was by Titus Kaphar, modern artist, that we had in the displayed in the Monticello parlor, that showed a representation of an enslaved person, but the face was done in tar. I'm sure I'll look for a link to put in so people can see it. But it was such an interesting, provocative way of bringing a representation of somebody who was enslaved into that main space, that it provoked conversation, which was really what we were trying to do. And at the same time that we had the Titus Kaphar works at Monticello, we also had a descendant of the enslaved community creating an artwork that represented a funeral of people who were enslaved at Monticello. And that one, it was just incredibly emotionally powerful, because it showed a scene that was never recorded, that we just didn't have any real other opportunity of how do you tell that perspective of the loss of somebody who's enslaved. And the artist just captured it beautifully. It's a multimedia. It has textured soil and different pieces of contemporary ways of mourning somebody who is lost, like kind of around the edges. But it's just a really powerful piece that I hope is still in the visitor center. I'm saying nod. So it was the two ways that at Monticello we had done it, and I've just been really interested by that how the arts can be used to help tell the voices of some of the history where we don't have the records.
I just wanted to share that we're going off of the arts as a way of telling the story at Degman. We've been working over the past several years to build our programming around the regional holiday Pinkster. And it was a Dutch holiday that then gave some of to celebrate the Pentecost. And during that week, the enslaved people were allowed to travel to neighboring farms and have their own celebration. And so we've been using dance, but all different music, all different forms of art to talk about this, very regional holiday that allowed a small amount of autonomy and allowed them to celebrate their culture as a way of interpreting this. But we absolutely have no idea, individually what that was like for the enslaved people at our site, but we can tell kind of a broader story through that.
I would just add on that the way that we present the lives of enslaved people, it's hard with George Washington being the center of everything. I'm just like, yeah, I mean, we do it in different ways. Programmatically, we have a teacher institute that we do every summer, 6 weeks. We have one particular week that's on slavery, 18th century. We make sure to put topics around slave society and what it was like in different themes during our teacher institutes. And we bring the descendants in for panel discussions to have their interpretation and their memories and views for discussion with our teachers. One example that we try to focus on, we don't have a lot of, like Steve was saying, like direct like primary sources from the enslaved, but we do have like Ona Judge, for example. We do tell her story pretty regularly. And example of someone whose narrative we have and can really illustrate that dichotomy and that duality. Yes, Never Caught. It's a great book. Or we talk about Sambo Anderson, who was a person on our site who basically was an entrepreneur on as much as you could be as an enslaved person. So we're able to do that because of the resources we have and just reading against the grain for our primary sources. And so we do that more of a programmatic way whenever we can. But it is difficult because our mission is George Washington. But like I said, we try to use him as and get in that way.
Can I just add one last thing too? I think that one of the difficulties at a lot of these sites is that the choice of what has been preserved over time and what has not, which is to say, people, particularly at a historic house, when you walk into a room, your guests typically are like, they want to know about what's in the room and they want to know what the room is for. And if all the material possessions are about the enslaver and the enslaver's family, it's really hard to get people to change that perspective and think about the lives of enslaved people. And so one thing that I think, Monticello has done for the last 10 or 15 years is to make sure where we can to either restore or replicate the built environment of the lives of enslaved people through reconstructions along Mulberry Row, which was a center of industry at Monticello, the installation in 2018 of the Life of Sally Hemings exhibit, which was in the space where Sally Hemings was likely raising her children and the children of Thomas Jefferson, because it can be very difficult in a place like the Parlor at Monticello, where you have all these amazing paintings, to talk about slavery, because one of your guests is probably going to interrupt you and ask you to tell you about that painting, which is, to Linnea's point, one of the reasons why we put the Titus Kaphar painting in the Parlor, to represent and to have a conversation about slavery with an object. But when you lack the material environment that represents enslaved people, it can be a lot more difficult.
It's just interesting to me to think that I first encountered Titus Kaphar's work at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and to think about the different context of it being displayed at Monticello is fascinating. So I have two more questions. We've touched on aspects of both of them, but I also want to make sure that we have some time for audience Q&A. The first is, how does the interpretation of slavery differ by region? I think folks have probably gotten a sense that, we have some sites that are, in Virginia and, large plantation sites, and we have, a couple of sites in the north, in northern cities. They're both, all of them have histories of slavery. And there are some similarities there, but there are also a lot of differences. So I don't know if there were any other thoughts about, the differences across region, some of the ways, we've heard some of the ways that northern sites are struggling. In a lot of ways, northern sites are behind, some of the southern sites in telling these stories, and there may be, institutional reasons for that. Lack of records, the challenge of surfacing these things, but there are also, as I think Melissa mentioned, dealing with the response of, there was slavery in New York City, that you still hear that despite the major exhibition of, now about 15 years ago, I think, slavery in New York at the New York Historical Society, right?
The only thing I had thought to add to that question also has to do with the interpretation variability and where your visitors are coming from as far as what limitations they may bring with them. So I say that because I primarily work with teachers, and I did at Montpelier and I still do now. And the manner in which I approach the subject matter of slavery and enslavement, and especially how I write it down on paper to advertise it to a national audience, like, I have to be careful with education standards. I mean, if I call a program anti-racist, I'm not going to get people apply from about 12 different states. And if I want to, do a program, I might have to be very careful in like how I word it, and maybe even the scholar that I choose, if it's someone who's known to be like a very radical speaker or something like that. The education standards landscape is a big deal, and a big influence on at least the interpretation of slavery for at least that particular audience of teachers and students.
I'd say it differs also for us. Obviously, we're right outside of DC, and we get like international, like visitors from all over the country, and kind of similar to what Emily was saying, like a lot of people come here and don't expect George Washington to be an enslaver or to talk about slavery at his house, which is surprising. And then we also don't talk about slavery as much past 1799, which was when George Washington died. So it's a different time frame of what slavery looked like. So we're mostly dealing with, like a different form, like a different, we're dealing with like wheat and, tobacco and things like that versus like cotton, which happens like right at the 18th, like around the 18th century. So we're kind of still in the South, but we talk a different time period about slavery. So I say that's a difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just as important as the regional differences. A good friend of mine, when we read Ira Berlin's tome, Many Thousands Gone, summed up this, 700 or 800 page book by saying slavery was different in different places and different times, right? And plantation slavery in Virginia in the 18th century was different from cotton plantations in the Deep South in, the first half of the 19th century, right?
And then adding on to that, it's like, but how do people form their perception of what slavery is outside of, historians who are actually studying it? And we had a lot of conversations at Monticello where it came down to a few popular culture touchstones, like the color purple, of that is somebody hears slavery, they've had this experience, an emotional connection through film, and therefore that is what slavery is. And that concept of slavery was different in different times and different places is a really hard one to convey.
Mm-hmm. All right, so my last question is a really big one, and several of you have alluded to these things, but I'll just put it out there. In what ways do you see the interpretation of slavery intersecting with contemporary issues of racism, racial justice, and equity. And I guess I don't expect the definitive statement on this, but maybe one way that it has entered into, Steve talked about Charlottesville. I mean, living in Charlottesville in 2017 definitely impacted how people were thinking about racial justice, equity, all of these things.
Yeah, I would say that was, I think, the majority of our, all of our staff live in the Charlottesville area. And so that event had a profound impact on Charlottesville, and it had a profound impact on how our Guide Corps wanted to interpret slavery. And I think the way, the intersection is that we can help people understand the present by connecting the dots to the past. And I think a site like ours is difficult to, you don't want your interpreters to be weighing in on modern political topics, but there are ways in which you can help people understand how the stories that we are talking about today are influenced and are directly impacted by this legacy of racism that has gone through the years. And if we want to be relevant and people to have a sense for, these aren't just like facts and dates and interesting stories about the past, we have to be trying to make those connections without necessarily, pulling people all the way forward into the 21st century. But I think it's an important topic, and certainly one in the aftermath of Charlottesville that a lot of our interpreters would get questions directly from visitors because these questions are on their mind. And I think visitors too are greatly impacted by modern events, and they have questions. And so we see an increase in those types of questions when these kind of events happen today, like Charleston or Charlottesville. People want to understand that story. And so you can take them back and help them understand that story.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of our sites, we have to walk the walk, right? I mean, we can't be speaking about racial injustice of the past without also, also working with descendants to make sure that the voices of the marginalized are heard and valued in a way that they have not been historically, and that making sure that those voices are not just, token one-off experiences for our museums. Like, these are genuine relationships that we need to be building at our sites to create better and more whole interpretation moving forward. But that's an equity issue. That's a justice issue. So, we need to be focusing our work in that space.
The contemporary issue that I think about, and that we have talked a little bit about, and Emily probably has a lot to add to it as well, working with teachers, is the issue of teachers being restricted in what they can teach and what they can say in the classroom. And I was at a event up here in New Hampshire just last week where I was talking to somebody who makes grants to different types of education organizations, and I was asking him, well, what could a museum like Strawberry Bank be doing to support this, the legislation, going against the legislation that is coming out in so many states about restricting teachers. And he said, just with so much passion, is that you, as a historic site, an independent historic site, nonprofit, you can tell the truth. When you get these students on site, you can show your work, show the history, but you're not going to be contained the same way the teachers are going to be contained. So he was imploring, and I'll say all of us who work in sites, to be able to share the truth of what has happened at our sites, the truth of the history of slavery with students, especially for teachers who might be scared or might be resistant to talking about slavery in the classroom.
Okay, well, Let's open things up now to our audience. We already have some questions in the chat. Audience members should feel free to type questions in the chat, and I will try to keep up with them. You can also unmute and share your question. If you do that, please just be sure to be respectful, to share your question, and then please mute again. So our first question comes from Dr. Soren. Do African American audiences have a higher level of knowledge about slavery in your experience? If you're meeting them where they are, I assume it might be a different place than other visitors. Is that true?
I'll jump in quickly with a couple observations and things I was thinking about. A good colleague of ours in Virginia, Richard Josie, at one point said that he thought there were greater similarities between a Black man who was 65 and a white man who was 65 than a Black man who was 65 and a Black man who was 25. So he was seeing a lot of generational disparities of knowledge and how they were approaching talking about conversations like slavery. And I'd say I saw some of that play out while I was at Monticello, where I did see a fairly large generational divide and prior knowledge. But of course, that's, it varies obviously by person, but I thought that was an interesting observation that kind of stuck with me.
And I would just echo what Linnea said. I think in general, yes, I think most African-American audiences have a better understanding of slavery and its history than most white visitors at our site. I do think there are still generational divides, and I have seen interpreters kind of make mistakes about assuming that certain people feel a certain way because of the way they looked, and that's always a very dangerous thing to do. One of the challenges I think we have at Monticello, and I think other sites, and we've had op-eds written about this, many white audiences do not view plantations as sites of pain. They have traditionally been viewed as beautiful places and places where you might want to throw a wedding. And as a result, visitors can often be insensitive to the idea that this is in many people's eyes, a forced labor camp. And so one of the challenges our interpreters sometimes have to kind of negotiate is when you have African-American audiences who very clearly understand this as a site of pain and white audiences who don't. And might make insensitive comments, and how do you negotiate those moments and make sure that you are upholding the perspective that this is a place of enslavement, and that is has been a challenge for us.
So Katie Boardman has added more comment, I think, but like fleshing out an aspect of our conversation about regional differences and differences over time. That the Dutch as slave traders is still a news story throughout New York State. Anybody want to pick up the Dutch?
I think I'm obligated. I mean, she's absolutely 100% correct. People, we get a lot of people who didn't realize the Dutch were enslavers. And then I point out the Dutch East India Company, and then we also get a lot of people who are a little more educated who will argue that, slavery was not as bad under the Dutch as it was under the British, which I think is a ridiculous argument. Owning people is still owning people, and it doesn't matter. That's semantics. It's horrible either way. So there's still a lot. I think that generally our country, they don't go so far back as to teach the part where the Dutch came and colonized and had slaves at that time. The main portion of what, or at least what I have taken from the students that we see, is they talk about, you know, slavery under British rule and then our independence from British rule and how we still had slavery. So so yeah, in a lot of ways the Dutch connection is still new to people.
I'll add to that, because actually my first museum job before I went to CGP was at a 1730 historical society that ran a 1737 Dutch farmhouse in upstate New York. And we were working on an interpretive plan that would incorporate the family that owned the house also enslaved people. And that story had never been told and was very, very little, if any, documentary record whatsoever of who the enslaved people were. But I remember at that time, and you know, this speaks to the question about people recognizing whether or not slavery happened in the North too. The board kind of shutting down any talk of interpreting the lives of the enslaved people, because in their mind they just wanted to talk about the architecture. And I hope that was sad for me to say over 20 years ago now, but so hopefully that has changed. But yeah, it was an interesting project.
Katie had another question. Are sites making connections with enslavement happening today? And Hillary Hicks, another alumna of the Cooperstown graduate program working at Montpelier, answered that question. One component of Montpelier's Mirror Distinction of Color is a video presentation where we ask people, what is slavery? Many of the answers include examples of modern slavery. And I can say, Hillary, I show pictures of that in class as an example of just this. So thank you for mentioning that. Okay, Lizzie Kirkchin asks, for sites that have minimal documentation of the enslaved people who lived and worked there, how do you start researching and talking about it?
I guess I can jump in. You know, when we started doing research, we had like one document that said that there was like one unnamed boy of a certain age. So we really did not have a lot, but our researcher started going through repositories, and a lot of them are online now, that you can search through. Manumission documents, runaway slave ads, these kinds of things, census records, to try and gather information. Is the reason that we have, you know, 5 names. I'm sure there were more, and you know, who were enslaved by the Dykmans, but those are the only records we were able to find. But it is kind of painstaking work, and you know, the first step is obviously fundraising to get a good researcher to do the work, and which is exactly how we did it. And then talking about it, I think when we started that, I will say, you know, at the time I was not the director, I'm newly appointed director, and leadership at the time was very bold, and would just go out there with the information. And so at one point we had an artist who projected on the side of the house, slaves lived here, in both English and Spanish, because we're in a mostly Spanish speaking neighborhood. And it was literally projected on the side of the house, and it caught people's attention. And so we just talked about it without fear of talking about it. And leadership also held the space for us to try different modalities for connecting with the community over this topic.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question from Emily Holmes. I am curious about any suggested resources and or training for sites who want to better train staff to talk effectively with visitors about a history of enslavement.
We had really excellent training from the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, particularly the Arc of Dialogue, but they came out to do training for Montpelier staff on at least 3 separate occasions. And every time it was really, really phenomenal training.
I would echo that. We did training as well, International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. There's a great, I think it's an AASLH pamphlet. I'm looking at Linnea, written by Julia Rosen, the 5 R's of Receiving Difficult Information, which we use in our training, which I think is helpful in training kind of empathy for any kind of how people react when they receive information that challenges their worldview. And Linnea also mentioned Kristen Gallus, who's also well known in the field and does a lot of great training as well.
Termia just dropped in a book recommendation too, which is really, really good, Interpreting Slavery to Children.
Yeah, I would say also basically the same thing that everybody else is saying. And I would also recommend, like, if you have like a group of staff and you maybe even start talking about enslavement, like talk to each other. Like we have huddles, our interpretation team have huddles to talk about like things that they've heard from visitors and like how to troubleshoot and how they've responded to them. So like learning from each other is also really helpful. And yeah, those are the kind of the main ways we do it. I would also say, just recommend also like exploring these issues yourself, like just going through and kind of investigating your own personal relationship to enslavement and this history. Because, you're going to go through this, at least I know with us, we go through this roller coaster of emotions between like, George Washington is pretty all right. And then, oh my God, like George Washington's horrible, So I think really doing that kind of work as well outside of the museum work, just personal investigation of your own identity as well.
We have one more really good question. So could I beg you to stay for 3 more minutes to answer this one more question from the chat? How do you know that the information, this is from Alicia Griffith, how do you know that the information you are gaining on slavery is reliable? Very often the deep truth of slavery is misconstrued as it is passed on and told.
I think that's a great question. I think for me personally, it's relying on my training. So CGP and your training as a historian. One of the things that we do with our guides at Monticello from the start is a session on what is history, and it's always asking questions. So the answer, I think, is you don't always know everything that you see is reliable, but you should always question it and look for different perspectives and look for multiple accounts. And I guess to be brief, just always question what your sources are and what the perspectives are.
I mean, this is one of the core challenges because the documentary record is so sparse in some areas, and in fact, completely absent in some areas and unreliable in others. Where someone used the phrase earlier, reading against the grain. A lot of the sources that we're looking at to interpret slavery were created by enslavers, that were sources that were basically there because this was a profit-based system that relied on enslaved people as commodities, as property. And so that system is dehumanizing. So how do you use those sources to talk about human beings, right? To tell stories of the lives of human beings. It is profoundly challenging. There are some wonderful work being done now. I think that is sort of pushing the boundaries of what we consider reliable, and pushing the boundaries of what historians are comfortable accepting as reliable research, and in important ways and profound ways that I think are opening up new ways of understanding and thinking about the experiences of enslaved people. So, for example, Taya Miles' work, tracing the history of, an enslaved mother and her child who were separated, through one piece of material culture, one object. It's kind of breathtaking, and it requires a great deal of creativity, which is something that buttoned up historians have long been uncomfortable with, but I think this kind of work requires it.
And also knowing that it's going to be a process that takes a long time, because there are, the records that are accessible to your site, but then, maybe the records show up in the next town over. So I guess just understanding that it's always going to be kind of that additive process, that you're going to be able to find out more, just maybe not today. And then every time you do learn something new, then be willing to make changes if the new information changes the way you have understood a person or the site in the past.
Great.
I was just going to add also that in addition to like the forensic truth, there's like the personal truth that people bring to this work. So like the descendants that we work with may have a very strong truth that they've passed down, but like at Mount Vernon, we don't have records of that. So it's like you have to balance and honor that at the same time, and actually it makes your interpretation richer to be able to bring both that forensic material but also the stories that people bring and that history. So everything that everybody said, plus also just acknowledging that there's that as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists and all of our audience members for being here with us. This was a wonderful conversation, and we look forward to seeing the many ways that you continue to bring these stories to broad audiences. As an academic historian, when I'm wearing that hat, you can write a book and maybe it reaches a few hundred people, 1,000 people. Museums are reaching millions of people every year. So they really have a profound influence on how people think about important histories and important issues like slavery and racism. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. This was wonderful.
We're good. Bye. Thank you.
Yeah, I think everyone else hopped off. So thank you both, and take care.